Book 2 of 4, Crossroads. Chapter 7, The Daily Bread. The ringing of an alarm clock in another part of the flat woke Hilda out of her first night's sleep under the Vassic roof. Through the open door, a shaft of light was falling into the room. It was 5 o'clock. The child was sound asleep in the crib beside her bed, and Hilda would not wake him. After the last nursing, he could go without food until 6, she figured. They had to pass through her room to get to the kitchen. There was no other way, and Mrs. Vassic slid through it noiselessly with her bare feet. Her husband followed soon after in his stockings. He did not look in the direction of Hilda's bed, but she saw that he was carrying his shoes in his hands. Mr. Vassic closed the door behind him quietly. A noise of someone washing was heard. A little later, the smell of fried potatoes and sizzling bacon reached her. Mrs. Vassic was making breakfast for her husband, Hilda thought, and a feeling of melancholy took possession of her. The unreality of her position was staring her in the face. What was she doing in this house among these people? What had she done to deserve this attention and consideration from them? The whole thing was but a propitious accident, which would end as suddenly as it came. There was no firm ground under her feet. There was no basis, neither in blood nor in money, for her status in the Bohemian home. She had been received and was treated as a guest, as a relation. She would have been more at ease had she been treated as a roomer and a stranger, which was the status she sought. An incident of her dim past rose to her mind. Hilda was about 5 years old. Her mother was alive yet. It was Halloween, and the neighbors' children had dressed up in fantastic garb. She followed suit. She put on an old dress and jacket of her mother's. She found a discarded hat and put that on too. Thus attired, she strutted up and down all the afternoon with mincing steps and grimaces, and experienced a sensation of being a grown person, of being a young lady. At nightfall, the illusion snapped. She was a child again, and she was weary. Ashamed of her actions and her pretenses, she ran into the house and hid her face in the folds of her mother's dress. She could not escape a feeling of participating in some such pretense now. She had no claim to this home and the attentions that had suddenly come to her. The friendship of Lydia, of Mrs. Vassic, was like a spring day in February, a chance episode of an hour from which no deductions were to be drawn. Spring was not coming in February. Her reception into the Vassic home was not solving her problems and difficulties. It would be a long time before she and her child would have a home, would feel at home anywhere. There was a long stretch of winter ahead of them. There must be no illusions. She was not a child now. Her fresh young body was asserting itself, however, and when she was dressed and walking up and down the room, she noticed with a feeling of satisfaction how much stronger she had grown since the previous afternoon. With every step she took, her limbs were becoming firmer. Her breakfast, which Mrs. Vassic insisted on preparing and serving, sent a flood of energy through her. Her brain gained in clearness, her thoughts in definiteness. The melancholy brooding had given way to concise, practical planning. She was figuring that a week's rest would be about all she would take, and then, grimly, she dismissed all thoughts of office work and of other more desirable jobs about which she had been dreaming up to the very coming of her child. No, she must keep her feet firmly planted on the ground. She was thinking of factory work, which was what she knew and had experience in. Only she would make an effort to get to a place where the work was steady and the pay better than it had been at the knitting factory she worked at last. She needed more money now. In the early afternoon, Lydia, who had been out of the hospital some days ahead of her and had rapidly recovered, came to see her. "You seem worried," her friend said after the first few questions about herself and the child. Hilda told her about the plans she was making for going to work. She was worried about finding a woman to take care of the infant during the day while she was at work. "You intend to go back to the factory?" Lydia asked. "What else can I do?" Hilda queried in return. Her friend shook her head doubtfully. "Have you thought of going to work in a restaurant as a waitress? We talked of it once before in the hospital." Hilda recalled the hospital conversation. "But," she said, "there doesn't seem to be any future in it." "No, there isn't much of a future in it," Lydia agreed. "But there'll be time to think about the future later. Right now, the problem is to pull your infant through the summer months." She was telling her what the summer months meant to newborn babies in that part of the city. It was mother's milk or death to many of them. The short day which restaurant work permitted would be a great thing for her child. Hilda was silent. There was nothing she could say. The child was pitifully small. There would be no one to give him a square deal if she did not. Her abhorrence for the restaurant job was due largely to the fact that it involved the taking of tips. A sense of delicacy, however, prevented her from mentioning this. Lydia's husband, Ernest White, though a musician by calling, as her friend had told her, was a waiter by trade. She was pondering over her friend's words the rest of the day. In the evening, Ernest White came. Lydia had introduced her husband to Hilda in the hospital, and they had exchanged a few words there. But this was the first time Mr. White saw Hilda dressed and on her feet. She was a changed person. Her looks and ways were so different that he could not conceal his surprise. White was a reader of books, and as she stood before him, lithe and graceful, she appeared to him like a character from one of the American novels he had read. Mrs. Vassick was fluttering about him. She led him into the parlor and drew the best chair toward him. She was beaming at Hilda, too. Apparently, Mr. White was of some consequence in Mrs. Vassick's circle, and she was proud of his visit. After a momentary awkwardness, due possibly to the fuss Mrs. Vassick was making over him, but more likely to the fact that the young woman standing before him was so different from what he had expected to find, he talked more easily. He asked after Hilda's condition, after the child. As Hilda answered him, as she was speaking, White's gaze dwelt upon her lips. He seemed to be listening to her not alone with his ears, but with his eyes. Her speech sounded new to him. It was Western. He was in agreement with his wife on the matter of Mrs. Thorson's occupation, he said. A job in a restaurant would serve her and her baby best at this time. It was, of course, immaterial to them. It was only out of friendship they were speaking. And then, without the slightest suggestion or mention from Hilda, Mr. White somehow seemed to divine the real reason for Hilda's disinclination to go into restaurant work, the tip-taking it involved. It was not without a struggle, he recalled, that he also accepted his first job as a waiter. With flushed face, he began to explain and modify his original statement. He did not mean, of course, that Hilda should stay in restaurant work permanently or even any length of time. He looked upon such employment for her as a makeshift only, until her child was older and she could go into something else. With him, too, his restaurant job was only a makeshift. He was marking time. Restaurant work was better than any other work for him because it was less tiring and gave him leisure to devote himself to his violin. His music called for leisure. White stayed for some time. He was asking her about Chicago, the West, and was making comparisons with New York. When Hilda first saw him in the hospital, he appeared to her as distinguished looking. A certain softness and simplicity which he possessed impressed her now. He spoke sincerely and gently. She was ascribing White's friendship, the kindness of his wife and of Mrs. Vassick to her, as being due to the fact that they too were strangers in New York. Apparently, it was an immigrant trait. Both her father and her mother, she recalled, had always been kind and hospitable. There certainly could not be anything but the most friendly intentions in their suggesting and even urging that she take up restaurant work. When White was gone, his voice, with the quaint foreign flavor in it, still seemed to be reverberating in the atmosphere. Hilda was thinking of many things, recalling many things. The constraint and tension of the day were gone. Her mood was mellowing. It was to be restaurant work, as her newly made friends had urged upon her, and it was not until after she had rested for fully 2 weeks, in this too she yielded to her friends, that Hilda went out to look for employment. She found a job in a bakery and lunchroom on 3rd Avenue within 8 or 10 minutes' walk from where she lived. It was a cheap place where expressmen, milkmen, and the like would stop in for a cup of coffee and a piece of pie around noon. No experience was called for. The pay was $2.50 a week, but with tips, a girl averaged $6. After 6 weeks in this place, when she had become accustomed to handling trays and taking orders, White pointed out to her an advertisement of a downtown restaurant calling for experienced waitresses. He suggested that she answer it. There was more money in such a place, he said, and she might as well make all the money she could. She would need it. Tell them, he gave her a final bit of advice, that you have 6 months' experience instead of 6 weeks, and you will probably get the job. She got it, and at the end of the first week, her wages mounted up to $9. That evening, when the child was asleep, she ran over to Lydia's home to impart to her and to her husband the good news. Here, a surprise awaited Hilda. The Whites had moved that very afternoon to a model tenement building which had just been completed in the neighborhood. Hilda went in search of them. Lydia threw her arms about her the moment she entered. "Look, look," she beamed as she led Hilda from room to room. The Whites had 3 rooms and a bath. The floors were of cement. There was electricity in every room. But what evoked Lydia's delight above all was the bath with the hot and cold water. Hot water all the time, as she emphasized it to Hilda. Only the best paid workers in the neighborhood could afford an apartment in the model tenement. Among the tenants, there were a number of social settlement workers, writers, and artists. Lydia was frankly delighted at the way she had come up in the world. Her husband was busy hanging pictures. A number of prints, framed and unframed, lay on the table in the parlor. Hilda stopped to examine them while Lydia went back to the kitchen. "Here's one that ought to be familiar to you," White said, handing Hilda a print by Remington, which represented a prairie scene in the far west. She explained that the location of this particular painting was probably 2 or 3 days' distance by train from where she was born and lived prior to her coming to New York. There were several more prints, and Hilda became absorbed in them. White walked over and stood beside her, gazing at the picture she held. It represented a lone Indian rider in the desert. In the distance was a chain of purple mountains. "Fascinating," White said softly. Hilda agreed that it was beautiful. "It must be wonderful out there, out west," he spoke dreamily. "It seems to me one could do big things there." Hilda was silent. "New York," he went on after a pause, "is an excellent place for old men, for men who have achieved, who have prospered and want to come here to get the glory for their achievements, to enjoy their prosperity. But it is no place for a young man unless his ambitions run to banking or commerce." Lydia in the next room overheard her husband's voice. She stepped up to the door of the parlor and remained there as if riveted to the spot. Hilda was almost a head taller than herself, and standing beside her tall, slender husband, the two made a striking pair. Neither White nor Hilda noticed Lydia. "I wonder," he continued, still gazing at the painting, "if all this, the prairies, the mountains, could not be reduced to music as well as to painting. There is music in them as well as color, a symphony of the desert." He became silent, and his gaze seemed transported. His wife stepped up to them. Hilda handed the print to her for Lydia to admire, but the latter put it aside without looking at it. She was gazing at her husband with a strange, unaccustomed look. A slight embarrassment came over White. From a tiny room in the rear of the restaurant came the clicking of a writing machine. The door stood open, and Hilda, who had begun to feel at home in the place, looked in. The cashier, Miss Lynch, was pounding out the day's bills of fare. The business day had not yet begun. When she saw Hilda in the doorway, she nodded to her with a smile. "Do you type?" Miss Lynch asked, resting from her work for a moment. "No, but I wish I did." "I never studied it systematically myself," Miss Lynch confessed. "I just picked it up. I worked in a place where there was a machine, and I practiced whenever I had a chance." Hilda was gazing at the machine wistfully. The cashier observed her look. "Would you like to try your hand at it?" she asked. "I am finished." She rose and surrendered her place to Hilda, who for the space of 10 minutes sat fishing about for letters on the keyboard, while Miss Lynch looked on good-naturedly. The feel of her fingers hitting the typewriter keys was with Hilda all that day, and ambitious that had lain dormant in her for many months began to stir. She was in the restaurant the next morning, 15 minutes earlier. Miss Lynch, who, in addition to being cashier, was also taking charge of the place when the manager was not in, guessed the reason for Hilda's early arrival. Without a word, but with a knowing smile, she directed the waitress to the office. Soon the sporadic beating of the keys became audible. For several days in succession, Hilda came to work a quarter of an hour earlier and, with Miss Lynch's tacit understanding, would at once immerse herself in the intricacies of the writing machine. "I guess you mean business," the cashier once said to her, when she observed a printed half-page sticking out of the typewriter. "That's remarkably quick work, I must say." "Do you really think so?" Hilda asked, her heart leaping within her. "I most certainly do," Miss Lynch assured her, and by way of proving her earnestness, She made several valuable suggestions about the machine and its operation. The following day, Hilda was fully half an hour ahead at the restaurant. Miss Lynch did not notice the change in her schedule. For weeks thereafter, the half hour at the typewriter every morning had become an absorbing event in Hilda's life. September came. The summer was over, and the time Hilda had mentally set as the limit to her staying in the occupation of waitress had arrived. But the thought of quitting the restaurant for the factory had lost its urgency. One morning, about the middle of the month, she requested the cashier for the day's menu and made it her practice lesson. When Miss Lynch looked over a few of the bills Hilda had printed, she decided to use them, and she let the girl go on typing the remainder of the cards. "You can have the job in the future," she said, half in jest. But Hilda walked in the clouds the rest of that day. Every time she saw a patron studying the bill of fare which she had typed, her face would assume a mysterious air, as if she and the printed slip had a great secret in common. She threw caution to the wind and gave her imagination full sway. Plans and ambitions were surging through her brain. The restaurant, her job, now appeared to her as the cornerstone of all these dreams and ambitions. She determined not to leave the restaurant work that winter and possibly not till the following autumn. She was earning well, and she had time. That was the main thing, time. By the spring, the child and her finances would both be in condition for her to consider going to a business college for a few months. And then she would bid the factory adieu forever. New horizons were opening before her eyes. But in October, the 5-story structure which housed the restaurant was sold. It was to be torn down, and an up-to-date skyscraper was to go up in its place. The owners of the restaurant were given 3 months' time to vacate the premises. In the next few weeks, the business wheels in the place began to turn more slowly. Several of the help left. Hilda stayed on till the very end. Miss Lynch, occupied with other work, definitely turned over to her the job of typing the bills of fare every morning. The typewriter had become like a friend from whom it was not easy to part. The first week in January, however, found Hilda looking for work. She found a job in a restaurant near Times Square in the heart of New York. By coincidence, her new place of work was just around the corner from the fashionable cafe where Ernest White was employed. Her new job brought with it complications and disappointments, chief of which was her break with the Whites, with Lydia and her husband, which followed within a month.